Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bergen Global. And thanks a ton for finding the time to attend this event today. To those of you who don't know me, I'm Pelle Valentin Olsen, and I'm Associate Professor of Middle East History here at the University of Bergen. Before we begin, I'd very much like to thank Bergen Global and especially Susanne Tord and the student interns for making this lecture series possible. Over the next year or so, I will have the honor of facilitating a series of conversations with experts about the contemporary Middle East. Our guests are going to help us navigate the historical as well as the contemporary political landscape and actors in this region that we call the Middle East. And the first conversation is actually going to take place today, right after my little presentation. So it'll start in 30 minutes, and it will focus on Yemen and the Houthis in Yemen. And I obviously hope that you will all stay here and attend that fascinating conversation. Also, keep an eye out for the Bergen Global social media, because we're going to announce the lecture series that are and conversations that are happening after the summer break. So the idea and motivation behind this series is to invite experts and scholars here to Bergen to help us make sense of current conflicts, different actors and their ideologies, as well as the role of regional and global powers. We're also going to try our very best to sort of zoom in on some of the histories we have not been taught, as well as the histories and perspectives that often or sometimes get reduced to footnotes in international media coverage of the Middle East. And we are going to try our very best to challenge some of the common assumptions that very often frame and organize how the Middle East is understood and talked about. I think it's by no means controversial to say that assumptions about the place of and importance of religion, sectarianism, and failed attempts to create democratic societies in the Middle East, that these assumptions tend to reduce the complexity and diversity of life throughout this very wide region to a series of simplistic and essentialist tropes. And in this lecture series over this coming year, we're going to challenge some of these assumptions. The title of this series is Who's Who in the Middle East. But before we get to that, perhaps we should ask first, what in fact is the Middle East? What is this weird, problematic geographic container that we are here to talk about today, the quote-unquote Middle East? In the next 25 minutes or so, I have this rather daunting task ahead of me, which is to try to offer up some thoughts and remarks about the Middle East. I prefer to have a full semester to do this, but 25 minutes will have to do today. And I should say that I am a historian, and I will do this from a historian's perspective. So, as you can see on this map, the term Middle East refers to a very large geographic region that's divided among more than 20 states. So what unites this region? Why should we even treat it as one thing? Some of the conventional ideas focus on religion, language, and ethnicity. So let's perhaps start with religion, and with Islam in particular. The region we're looking at is where Islam originated, along with dozens of other major religions. Its population today is overwhelmingly Muslim, and it remains home to the holiest sites of Islam, Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. But over the past 12 centuries, Islam expanded throughout the world, the entire world. And if we wanted to talk about an Islamic world today, we would have to talk about South Asia, China, East Asia, West Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean, and the Americas as well, all of which have Muslim communities. And when we look at religious communities in this region, we see tremendous diversity. It's, of course, the place of origin of Judaism and Christianity. And there have been Jewish communities living throughout this region for millennia. There have been Jewish people in Baghdad as long as Baghdad has existed. And the same can be said for Cairo. There's also a great diversity of Christian communities. Lebanon alone has 12 formally recognized Christian denominations, and there are dozens more elsewhere. There's also a great diversity of Muslim faith communities, including Sunnis, Shia, Druze, Alawis, and there are smaller religious communities like Baha'is, Yazidis, and Zoroastrians. So we can't easily define this region, the Middle East, by religion alone. But what about language? Is this a region where everyone speaks the same language? Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Tamazight, Armenian, Hebrew, Kurdish, and Assyrian are just some of the languages that originate in this region. English and French are widely spoken, which is both a remnant of European imperial rule and the product of the more recent global hegemony of English. And there are languages spoken by hundreds of thousands of migrant workers in places like the Gulf, Hindi, Urdu, and Filipino. Now, what about the Arab world? Can we talk about this as the Arab world? Arab is an ethnic identity concept as well as a political project around that identity. One outcome of that project is the Arab League, which brings together diplomats from 12 countries designated as the Arab countries. So can we define this region as the Arab world? I think, again, no, just as with language, and here the border between language and ethnicity is really quite porous. Two of the largest countries in the region are not Arab countries or part of the Arab League. Turkey, which is majority ethnic Turkish, and Iran, which is majority Persian. And every country in this region is home to many ethno-linguistic groups. For an example, Nubians in Egypt and Sudan, Amazigh across North Africa, and Kurds in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And as I hope will become clear throughout this lecture series, it would be simplistic to view this ethnic, religious, and linguistic plurality as the cause of conflict in the contemporary Middle East, at least if we don't also look at factors such as power and class, for an example. We should also remember that the term Middle East is a relatively recent term. As you can see on this map, or these maps, and these later maps, the region has been defined and understood differently at different historical moments, and very often from the outside. But here I would very much like to add that just because the Middle East has been defined from the outside, and that European colonialism played a role in drawing some of the region's modern borders, Middle Eastern states are neither more or less artificial than other states. And I think Iraq is a good example. Iraq is the country that I mostly work on and research. We often hear the narrative or the myth that Iraq is an artificial state, that it's an irrational amalgam of heterogeneous peoples who don't at all belong together. And the argument generally goes something like this. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Mandate System fabricated a collection of artificial and incoherent states in the Middle East that were destined to collapse because they weren't ethnically or religiously homogeneous. But I think this narrative erases the history of Ottoman and Mandate Iraq. In fact, we can say that the map of Ottoman Iraq was the foundation for modern Iraq, and that local nationalists, popular uprisings, and insurgencies were just as crucial in shaping Iraq's borders as colonial powers were. But different actors, political actors, throughout history have made use of the claim that Iraq is artificial and unnatural. For an example, the British claimed that Iraq was an artificial state and that it was not yet coherent enough to govern itself, and that it therefore must be governed by Britain until such time as its population came together to form a coherent nation. More recently, the US revived this argument to justify the 2003 war and to explain why the 2003 occupation of Iraq failed to produce the democratic institutions that it had promised to build. And perhaps more recently still, Daesh or ISIS, trying to govern a territory that straddled Syria and Iraq, in many ways obsessed over the Sykes-Picot agreement and the idea of an artificial border that divided this region and portrayed themselves as decolonizing these artificial states. In each case, this is a narrative that draws on a fantasy of ethno-sectarian homogeneity, the idea that a homogeneous nation is necessary to support a real state. But that kind of national homogeneity was, I think, and remains impossible everywhere. And it also draws on the idea that only some states are artificial while others are perfectly natural. So I think in spite of its complexity, the Middle East is a region whose many diverse histories are often widely misrepresented and misunderstood. A common approach to understanding the region is to see it as a set of political problems, security problems for the US and Europe, geopolitical problems for regional stability, social problems of human rights abuses and inequalities structured by gender, race, and religion. Now, we are going to look at the Middle East through this lens, but we're also going to remember that identities in the Middle East, be they ethnic, religious, linguistic, national, or regional, have never been static or fixed. They are the result of complex historical, religious, cultural, social, economic, and political processes. But these identities, including Sunni and Shia, Arab, and Jew, just to mention two examples, have been mobilized, used, and abused, and put in service of different political projects in the past as well as today. Exactly how and why is one of the questions that I hope this lecture series is going to help us understand and answer. And I think perhaps one of the clearest examples of the dangers of seeing identity in the Middle East as fixed and static, and an example of the dangers of seeing the current Middle East and its conflicts as the inevitable or predetermined outcome of history, perhaps the best example is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And more specifically, the idea that Arab and Jew have always been fundamentally opposite categories. It was not, I think, an ancient hatred between Arabs and Jews that created the conflict. It was the conflict that created the antagonism that we see today. I think we should remember that until the middle of the 1950s, there were large Jewish communities all over the Middle East. It is really only in the 1950s that many Middle Eastern Jews begin to immigrate to Israel and elsewhere. Most leave their home countries, not necessarily because they were committed to Zionism and the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, but because the 1948 war and the way in which both Zionism and Arab nationalism increasingly began to conflate Judaism and Zionism, which made Jewish life in the Middle East difficult, if not impossible. But we should, of course, remember that Judaism and Zionism are not the same. Judaism is the world's oldest monotheistic religion, around 4,000 years old. Zionism, on the other hand, is a modern nationalist movement which emerged towards the end of the 19th century. Not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. In the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, most Jews in the Middle East were part of the Ottoman Empire, and later the Arab nation-states that replaced it. And in most of the Middle East, before 1948, Jews were an accepted and integrated part of the cultural, political, and economic life of the region. Many spoke Arabic as their mother tongue. Some were Arab nationalists, some were religious, some were secular. Many were socialists and communists and criticized both Zionism, Arab nationalism, and European colonialism. Some did not wish to become part of a Jewish state in Palestine and saw Zionism as a threat to their integration in their home countries. There were, of course, Jews in the Middle East who did support Zionism, but even those who did often criticized how European Zionists viewed the Palestinians. And we should, of course, not romanticize this history, but also remember that different types of identities and coexistence was possible. What you see here on the left is a Egyptian stamp with Leila Murad on it. Leila Murad was an Egyptian Jewish singer who is probably one of the most loved and celebrated singers and actresses in modern Egyptian history. Below, you see beauty contests were quite popular in the 20th century in the Middle East. In the middle, you see Miss Baghdad from 1947, an Iraqi Jewish woman. And then on the right, you see a group of Iraqi Jewish communists who established a society called the League for Combating Zionism, which was a militant Jewish organization that fought against Zionism and the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. We should not forget this diversity, nor attempt to romanticize it. For several decades after 1948, many of the Middle Eastern Jews who came to Israel were met with racism. As a European Jewish and elite project, Zionism looked down upon Middle Eastern Jews. Many European Zionists saw the Middle Eastern Jews as primitive and too Arab. While this is no longer the case, again, without romanticizing, we should not forget that there were real attempts to actually create Arab Jewish and Israeli Palestinian solidarities. What you see here is a poster made by the Israeli Black Panthers, inspired by the American movement. They were made of Middle Eastern Jews in Israel who fought for social justice, and some of them also fought to create solidarities with Palestinians. Another common assumption, I think, which is a result of the Israel-Palestine conflict, a conflict that is in some ways at the heart of the modern Middle East. A result of this conflict, rather than its cause, is that we have come to accept, in many ways, the idea that the Middle East is a particularly anti-Semitic place and that it is particularly hostile towards Jews. But anti-Semitism was historically never a problem in the Middle East the same way that it was in Europe. And there is, in fact, a very long tradition in the Middle East for criticizing European anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Particularly during the Second World War, many Arab intellectuals loudly criticized Nazism and fascism in Europe. And I just wanted to show you a couple of caricatures from mostly Egyptian newspapers during World War I that accompanied articles that fiercely criticized fascism in Europe, not least because of how it treated Europe's Jewish population. And I'm sure you're all aware what is taking place right now across college campuses in the US and in many other parts of the world. I'm talking about these Palestine encampments. I think that also in some ways shows that the Middle East is not just something that happens over there. The Middle East is and has been an integral part of global power relations and struggles. Many students are now talking about or calling for a student intifada. According to pro-Israeli groups, many American politicians and university administrators, using the word intifada is anti-Semitic and equals calling for the genocide of Jews. But intifada is an Arabic word that literally means shaking off. In the Palestinian context, it is understood to mean an uprising. The first Palestinian intifada erupted in Gaza in December of 1987. It was nonviolent. The second Palestinian intifada began in 2000 and did turn violent. But my point here is that intifada was used to describe uprisings against oppression long before the Palestinian intifadas. It is often how the 1968 student uprising in Europe is described in Arabic. And it has been used in Arabic to describe Western Saharan independence struggles. Finally, Intifada was the name given to the very large uprising in Iraq in 1952, when students, workers, communists, and many others rose up in protest and strikes against British influence and the Iraqi monarchy. And that actually brings me to another, and perhaps my final point, which is the role of sort of uprisings and attempts to create social justice in the Middle East. I think the wave of uprisings across the Middle East, which began in 2010, the uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring, and which have continued ever since. Like the term Arab Spring implies, many have portrayed and understood these uprisings as a kind of political awakening, a major rupture from the past. I think we should rather see these uprisings and revolutions as a continuity of a legacy of struggles for popular sovereignty and social justice that have been raging for the past 2 centuries in the Middle East. There's a long history of revolutions in the region, in Algeria, Palestine, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Oman, and Iran. And if we go back a little further, we see that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, like many places across the globe, constitutional movements, revolutions, and experiments emerged in the Ottoman Empire, Tunisia, Egypt, Iran, and Syria. Had these been able to actually play out, had these movements had the time to solve their internal contradictions on their own, things would most likely look quite different today. This is what historian Elizabeth Thompson has called justice interrupted, because none of these political movements were allowed the time and autonomy they needed to play out on their own. None of them took place in a vacuum of global power relations, and each of them was cut short by external and internal powers. But what I'm trying to say is that the Middle East is not and has never been static. There's always been change, and people have always fought for better lives and social justice. But I want to end on a slightly different note, actually. These photographs come from a studio in Lebanon, in Saida, in southern Lebanon. It is a studio that belonged to Hashim al-Madani, an at first amateur Lebanese photographer who established a photo studio in 1948 and began photographing local people from Saida, their weddings, their celebrations, and other things. The studio was destroyed by the Israeli invasion in 1982, but was recently rediscovered by a Lebanese artist who has been curating these now forgotten photographs. Now, this picture might confirm some of our assumptions and prejudices about the Middle East, right? Young men with guns. And it is true that in the 70s, in this moment of revolutionary fervor in the Middle East, this is the moment of the Palestinian Revolution. It is also the moment of the Lebanese civil war. Many men would come into the studio and ask to have pictures taken with guns as a sign of power, perhaps as a sign of manhood. But also look at their really fashionable pants, right? There's also other things going on. And I think I made this point about not reducing the Middle East to conflicts, politics, and religion. While these pictures were popular, most of the pictures from this studio looked like this. Photography was a new medium. People came in to play around, fool around, joke around with their identities. They came in to recreate scenes that they had watched in Hollywood movies, which were incredibly popular at the moment in Lebanon, or Egyptian movies. Now, in a social conservative society, it was not always okay to recreate kissing scenes from movies with the opposite sex, but you could do it with your friends. And there weren't only guns, there were also guitars, right? And I think what I'm trying to end on a more positive note. I'm teaching a class this semester, which is called Leisure, Pleasure, and Entertainment in the Modern Middle East, which also tries to pay attention to the way in which most people have always sought or fought to live daily lives, to have fun, to have leisure. And while this lecture series is going to focus on some of the conflicts, we shouldn't forget that most people are also trying to live moments of normal life. On that, I think I will actually end. We now have time for a 5-minute coffee break. There are also like falafel wraps outside. So take a short break and come back for the Yemen event in 5 minutes. Thank you.